There is a little more about going to Austin, which I want to add. Now, this was when I was 13. It was the summer before I started to high school. And my daddy took me to Austin again. Now, I can't remember whether the rest of the family went at that time or not. But what I remember is that my daddy took me to the University of Texas. And we met Lucy Lee on the campus. She had gone to Trinity for 2 years and had transferred to UT because she couldn't get the education courses she wanted at Trinity. And so we met her, and she led us to the freshman dormitory. And I remember she showed us all through the dormitory, and I was very impressed with it. And then my daddy surprised me by taking me to the registrar's office and pre-registering me as a student at the University of Texas to come in 4 years when I finished high school. And he went back to the dormitory and he reserved a room for me in the freshman dormitory for that year when I would be ready to enter the University of Texas. So he had me all ready to go. And I remember walking around the campus with him, and they had just recently installed the fountain in front of the tower. Now, I don't remember whether the tower was new at that time too, or whether we had seen the tower originally on our first visit and only the fountain was new. But I just remember us walking around and examining that wonderful fountain in front of the tower. And I loved especially those horses in the fountain. So that is something I remembered when I was 13 and my daddy was preparing me to enter the University of Texas in 4 years. And that's the end of this little segment. Now, could you end it? Because I want to say something just to you. Another incident which I think I forgot to tell about when I was talking about the period when I was about 7 or 8. But I remember then that we had lots of hobos. That was in the early 1930s, and we were in the depths of depression. And there were a lot of men who rode the freight trains from town to town, and then would come asking for food to help them keep going. And my daddy said that he had many of those men come to him at the bank asking for money. And he never gave them money because he was afraid they would buy whiskey with it. So instead, he would send them down to a cafe nearby. And he would call the cafe and ask them to serve a big dinner to this person so they would get their fill of food. And he did that over and over for so many hobos. And then we got a lot of hobos coming to our house. Many of them. And someone told us that they had heard that in the hobo camp down by the railroad yard, where they would spend the night after riding a railroad car, they talked about the best places to get food. And they always mention our house as a good place to come. And we found on our front curb in front of our house, there were some strange marks that had been painted on the curb. And someone told us that the hobos had printed those there, and it meant that you could get good food there. And sure enough, I can remember often when I was playing in the front yard, I would look down the street. We lived in a corner lot, and the side of our house had a street that went down, about 6 blocks, just about, and ended just about 2 blocks from the business district. So it went almost to downtown. And we would look down that street as far as we could see sometimes, and we would see a hobo walking up. He never stopped anywhere and came directly to our house and asked for food. He would tell my mother he was hungry and ask if he could have food. And my mother always served them a good meal. If she didn't have anything cooked up, she would at least cook a big skillet full of scrambled eggs and bacon and fixed toast. And then she would give them some cake or pie, which she had on hand. So they always got a big meal when they stopped at our house. And evidently they had let the other hobos know about that. And I remember that I used to love to sit by them and talk to the men. And they usually sat out on our back steps or under the grape arbor to eat. And I would sit beside them and ask them questions about where they had been and what they had seen. And I was fascinated by those men. I loved those men. And I was entertained by them. And oh, I loved them. And so that period when we were getting so many hobos was a fascinating, happy period for me. And my mother worked very hard to keep them fed. And my daddy would pay restaurants to feed the ones that came to him. So I got to see all that happening and got a good example of the way you ought to treat people who are having bad luck. So that's my story with the hobos. Then I remember also that I had forgotten to talk about Glenrose. Now, the little bank in Glenrose had a relationship with the bank where my father worked. And so my father had to go there regularly to check on that bank. And if I was not in school, he always took me with him. And I loved going to Glenrose. Now, on the way, we did not pass directly by Camp Tres Rios. The road to it was off to the side a little. But I learned, and we did go by it later, that on one long side of the property of Camp Tres Rios ran the Brazos River on one side. And on the other long side was Squaw Creek. And Squaw Creek ended in the Paluxy River. And the Paluxy River then ran over that short distance across the back of Camp Tres Rios to the Brazos River. So the Paluxy connected the Brazos and the Squaw. And that was why it was called Tres Rios. And the Paluxy then ran on west down to the town of Glenrose and through it and on beyond it a ways, west beyond it. So that was the first thing that I knew of on the east side of Glenrose. But as we were driving into Glenrose, what we saw first on the left was a camp. And my daddy always pointed out to me every time the fountain where, as a teenager, it was first built, and he and a group of teenagers whose family had just gotten a car came over to Glenrose and played around that fountain. Now, the water in the fountain smelled and tasted like rotten eggs, but it was supposed to be very healthy. It was a healthy mineral water. Now, this fountain was built of concrete in the shape of the trunk of a tree, and then with branches extending from the tree. And the water then came out the branches. Those were the parts of the fountain where you could get water and drink it. And oh, they thought that fountain was the neatest thing. And I still have a bunch of pictures of my daddy as a teenager with his friends on that fountain, standing on that fountain. Anyway, he always pointed out to me as we drove into Glen Rose. And then on the right side, a little further down, was the swimming pool. The only swimming pool in that whole area. There was none in Cleburne, none in any of the other communities around there. But this was a really nice swimming pool. And there were cottages all around that you could rent. The cottages were like that summer house at my friend Jeanette's house where we put on our little place. It would just have walls. They would have walls of net, screened in walls, and then a roof. So it had a floor and a roof with screen in between. And then there would be rolled up canvas above each of the screened walls. And you could roll the canvas down at night for privacy. Well, there were a number of those cabins around the swimming pool. And people loved to go there on vacations. So that was that park. It was called Oakdale. And then across the road from that were those funny looking big rocks where my Sunday school teacher had taken us for a sunrise breakfast. And they became a state park a little later on. They were very unusual. So those were the things on the entrance to Glen Rose. And then you started getting into the homes. And many of the houses in Glen Rose were built of brown rocks and petrified wood. They found a huge amount of petrified wood there. And so they used it to build houses. And we thought it was so pretty. And I just loved it. And they just looked so neat. And so the houses were just very interesting to look at. And then I remember we got down and there was a service station, and then you got down into the business district. There was a courthouse, and there were businesses all around the courthouse. Oh, and down a little ways, and there was a bank across from the courthouse, and that was the bank that my daddy had to check on. Mr. Bridges was the banker. He was always so nice to me and made me feel so important. And the thing that was important to me about him was that he raised Palomino horses. And he had beautiful Palomino horses that he always rode in parades when we had a parade. He always headed the parade in one of his palominos. And I remember every time I got to go there, he would tell me about his horses. And one time he took Daddy and me up to see his horses. And there was a bluff around all that business district and part of the residential district, a high bluff in Glen Rose. And on top of that bluff, there were two big white buildings which were sanitariums. And in the 1920s, those sanitariums had been very popular as a health resort where people would come and drink that crazy mineral water. Now, it was never as popular as mineral wells, but it was on that same order. So, Mr. Bridges' home was up on top of this cliff around the business district. And he took us up there, and he had one of those houses built of petrified wood and brown stone, which we got to examine, and that was so neat. And then he took us back to his barn to see his horses. And oh, they were so beautiful. And I loved getting to see his horses. So that was the main thing for me in Glen Rose, was getting to see his horses. Now, something else happened a little later. It still wasn't as important to me as the Palomino horses, but it was discovered in the Paluxy River west of Glen Rose. It was discovered that there were some tracks of dinosaurs there. And some group in Glen Rose had put concrete in one of those tracks and dug it up and brought it in and set it on the courthouse square. And they had built a stand around it. So with the steps where you could go up and see it like it was on a table-like thing. And you could see it in that little stand, and there was a roof over it, and it was a really nice place to see the dinosaur track. And my daddy took me over there and showed it to me and told me a little about dinosaurs. Well, I thought that was really interesting. It still was not as interesting as when Mr. Bridges took us up to see his palominos, but it was still interesting. Then, for some reason, that track of the dinosaur had to be moved. I was told it was some kind of legal reason that they had to take it down and move it. Then when I was at Camp Tres Rios one year, they put our camp, all of us in camp, in a big truck. We stood up in the back of a big truck. Excuse me. I have to have a drink. and they drove us over west of Glenrose, where those dinosaur tracks had been found. And we were let out of the truck to sit on a grassy hillside above the river, and somebody who was an expert on dinosaurs was brought in to talk to us about it. And he gave us all this information. It was far more than what I could understand, but it was still fascinating to me. And then they let us go down 2 or 3 at a time to stand down on the river where the dinosaur tracks were and see them real good in the river. And that was very interesting. So those are some of my early memories of Glenrose. Oh, I almost forgot. Also, once when I guess Ann was 3 or 4, and I was about 8 or 9, I guess. My family rented a little cottage on the Paluxy River, just past the courthouse on the main road in Glenrose. There was a little camp with about 3 or 4 of white frame little houses. They were so attractive. And my parents rented one of those for 3 or 4 days. And I remember it was just about half a block west of the courthouse and the bank. And it was on kind of a bluff above the Paluxy River. But Ann and I walked down a little path down through the bluff to the river each day, and we would play in the Paluxy. It was very shallow along there, and we had such a good time playing in the Paluxy, and I loved staying there at that time. So, those are just some of my early memories of Glenrose. I loved it so.